I'm Elaine Rourke, 33, and I worked my way up from a scholarship ROTC kid to a commissioned officer in the Air Force. For years, I covered bills, solved emergencies, and carried more weight for my family than they ever knew. But when my own parents filed a life insurance claim on me, before I was even dead, everything shifted. Ever been used, dismissed, or blindsided by the people you thought you could trust? If you have, tell me your story in the comments. You're not the only one. Before I dive into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to pull yourself up after someone tried to take advantage of you, hit like and subscribe for more real stories about drawing the line and taking your power back. What happened next might surprise you. I stand in front of my bathroom mirror at 05:30, hands braced on the counter, staring at a face that's supposed to be dead tomorrow. My phone sits beside the sink, screen dark now, but I can still see the link Jenna sent me 2 hours ago. The one I've opened and closed 6 times since. Major Elaine Rourke, United States Air Force, age 34. Died in a training accident. Services pending. I'm methodical by nature and by training, so I do what I always do when something doesn't make sense. I break it down into components. Component 1, I'm alive. Component 2, someone published my obituary. Component 3, the date of death listed is tomorrow. I should be more rattled than I am, but 12 years of service teaches you to compartmentalize. Fear doesn't help you fly. Panic doesn't help you lead. So I breathe, steady and controlled, and I start getting ready for work like it's any other Thursday. The strange thing is, I've felt something off for months now. Small things. The kind of things you notice, but don't quite trust yourself to name. My mother asking about my training schedules with a new kind of precision. My father wanting to know about deployment rotations, alert statuses, exercises that would take me away from base for extended periods. They'd never been particularly interested in the operational side of my career before. They liked the prestige, sure. They liked telling people at church that their daughter was an Air Force officer. But the actual work, the actual risk, that had always made them uncomfortable. So when they started asking questions, detailed questions, I told myself they were just getting older. Maybe they were worried. Maybe they'd started watching the news more. Then there was the life insurance conversation. My father brought it up over dinner at their house about 4 months ago. I'd driven down for the weekend, rare time off between training cycles. He asked if I'd ever considered increasing my policy given the danger of my line of work. I told him the Air Force coverage was comprehensive and I'd supplemented it reasonably. He pressed. Wouldn't I want to make sure they were taken care of if something happened? I'd looked at him across the table, my fork halfway to my mouth, trying to understand when I'd become responsible for their retirement. I'd been helping them financially for years. The car I bought my mother when I made captain. The new roof on their house last year. The credit card bill I'd quietly paid off when my father's hours got cut. None of that had ever been framed as obligation before, just family helping family. But the way he said it that night, there was an edge. An expectation. My mother had jumped in then, softer, asking who I'd listed as my beneficiaries. Just curious, she'd said. Just want to make sure everything's in order, honey. You're so busy, we know you probably haven't thought about these things. I had thought about these things. I'd updated my paperwork after my last deployment. But something in her tone made me cautious, so I deflected. Said I'd check with legal. Changed the subject. The temperature in the room had dropped. Not dramatically. Not enough to call it a fight. Just a chill, like I'd failed some test I hadn't known I was taking. Then came the family emergency form. They'd presented it to me 6 weeks ago, printed on nice paper, official looking. They said it was something they'd had drawn up so that in case of emergency, they'd have the legal authority to access my information, make decisions if I was incapacitated. My father had explained it in his calm, reasonable voice. My mother had nodded along. It seemed sensible, they said. Responsible. I'd read through it. It was vague in all the wrong places and specific in all the ways that made my legal training itch. I'd told them I appreciated the thought, but I'd need to have base legal review it first. My father's jaw had tightened. My mother's smile had gone rigid. They'd put the form away, and we hadn't spoken about it again, but the warmth that used to fill their living room hadn't quite returned. The final piece, the one that should have made me act sooner, was Daniel. My cousin. Technically second cousin, my father's sister's son, a guy I'd seen maybe twice growing up and not at all in my adult life until a year ago. Suddenly, he was at every family gathering. Suddenly, my parents deferred to him on anything financial. He called himself a consultant, though as far as I could tell, he'd bounced between jobs in insurance sales, real estate, and some kind of investment advisory role that never seemed to last more than 18 months. He had that smooth confidence of someone who'd learned to talk a good game, and my parents ate it up. At that same dinner where my father brought up life insurance, Daniel had been there. He joked, grinned really, and said if anything ever happened to me, at least someone in the family knew how to handle the payout. Everyone had laughed. I hadn't. I'd watched him across the table, watched the way my parents looked at him like he was the responsible one, the smart one, and I'd felt something cold settle in my chest. I'd told myself I was being paranoid. Deployments do that sometimes. You spend enough time in high-stress environments and you start seeing threats everywhere. But I'd also stayed in the Air Force long enough to trust my gut when something felt wrong. And this felt wrong. It felt like they'd stopped seeing me as a daughter and started seeing me as an asset. A line item. A policy waiting to pay out. Now, staring at my phone on the bathroom counter, I know I wasn't paranoid. I pick it up and open the link again. The Obituary is hosted on a regional news aggregator, the kind that pulls from funeral homes and public records. It looks legitimate. My full name, rank, base assignment. Survived by parents Thomas and Marion Rourke. Cause of death, training accident. In lieu of flowers, donations can be made to the Air Force Assistance Fund. It's detailed. It's convincing. And it's dated for tomorrow. I check the time. 05:42. I need to get to work. I need to report this. But first I need to understand what I'm reporting. I open my email, scanning for anything unusual. There, third from the top, flagged by my bank's security system, an alert about a claim filed against my life insurance policy. Filed yesterday. Pending review. Claimant listed as next of kin. I click through to the details. My parents. Joint claimants. Co-signed by Daniel Rourke. My hands don't shake. That surprises me. I'm calm. Clear. I screenshot everything, back it up to 3 separate locations, and then I get dressed. My uniform is pressed, my boots are polished, my hair is regulation perfect. If someone's trying to kill me on paper, they're going to find out I'm a lot harder to erase than they thought. I grab my keys and my phone and I head for the door. The sun isn't up yet. The base is quiet. And I've got a lot of calls to make. I'm sitting in a conference room at the Security Forces building at 07:15 when the full scope of it hits me. Public Affairs confirmed it first. Captain Marcus Dennehy pulled the Obituary from 3 separate aggregator sites and 2 local news feeds. He'd verified the submission timestamps. Someone had filed this through what appeared to be legitimate funeral home channels. The kind of access that requires credentials or at least convincing forgery. He looked at me across his desk with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between concern and disbelief, and said they were flagging it for investigation immediately. Then Technical Sergeant Rowan Pike from Security Forces walked me through the life insurance claim documentation. The signatures looked right. Too right. Someone had practiced. Someone had studied my handwriting, my husband's signature from years ago before the divorce, even the way I loop my initials on official documents. TSGT Pike had slid a folder across the table and said the claims adjuster had already noted inconsistencies in filing dates and contact information, but without my direct report, they might have processed it. Might have paid out. I'd nodded. Stayed calm. Asked the right questions. Took notes. But underneath, my mind was racing. Because if this was real, if my parents had actually done this, then I needed to understand how far they were willing to go. I'd asked TSGT Pike if there was any indication of when they expected the obituary to become true. She'd paused, glanced at Dennehy, and said that was the part that worried them most. The training schedule. I was supposed to be flying a night sortie tomorrow as part of a multi-day exercise. High-risk maneuvers. Low visibility. The kind of training where accidents, while rare, were plausible. If something went wrong, if I actually died, the obituary would already be out there. The claim would already be filed. My parents would look grief-stricken but prepared. Organized. Responsible. I'd left security forces and gone straight to my squadron. Colonel Jason Whitford had been in his office early, as usual, reviewing flight schedules over coffee. I'd knocked, waited for his signal, and then I'd briefed him. Concise. Professional. No emotion. He'd listened without interrupting, and when I finished he'd leaned back in his chair and said he was grounding me from tomorrow's sortie effective immediately. Not because he thought I couldn't fly, but because he wasn't putting me in the air when someone might be expecting me not to come back. He'd picked up his phone and called the Judge Advocate General's office, then OSI. Office of Special Investigations. The Air Force's federal law enforcement. By 0800, I had an appointment scheduled. I'd walked back to my office in a daze that I couldn't afford to feel. I had emails to answer. Reports to file. A flight brief to update now that I wasn't flying. I forced myself to focus. Work was steady. Work made sense. Work didn't require me to process the fact that my own parents had tried to cash in on my death before it happened. I made it until 1000 hours before I broke down enough to call my mother. I don't know what I expected. Panic, maybe. Denial. An explanation that made this all make sense. Instead, I got her voicemail. I hung up and tried my father. He answered on the third ring. I said I needed to talk about something important. He said he was busy. I said it couldn't wait. He sighed, that specific sigh he'd perfected over years, the one that said I was being dramatic and inconvenient. I asked him directly if he'd submitted anything regarding my life insurance. Silence. Then he asked why I was asking. I told him there'd been a claim filed in my name. He said I must be mistaken. I said I wasn't. I said I'd seen the paperwork. He said if something had been filed, it was probably just preparation, estate planning, the kind of thing Daniel had been helping them with. Responsible planning. I asked why they'd need to plan for my estate when I was alive. Another silence. Longer this time. Then he said I sounded stressed and maybe I should talk to someone. A chaplain maybe. Someone who could help me process the pressures of my job. I'd felt it then. The shift. Not the shock of betrayal, I'd already absorbed that. This was colder. This was the moment I realized he wasn't going to admit anything. He was going to gaslight me. Make me sound unstable. Paranoid. I'd asked if Mom was there. He said she was resting. I said I'd call back. He said that might not be a good idea, that I should take some time to calm down first. I'd ended the call. Sat in my office staring at the wall. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. But something inside me had gone very still. At 1300 hours, I met with Special Agent Lila Hearn from OSI in a secure conference room in the base legal building. She was early 40s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of calm that comes from seeing too much. She'd reviewed the preliminary reports from security forces and public affairs. She'd pulled my personnel file. She'd already started a background check on my parents and Daniel. She asked me to walk her through everything from the beginning. I did. Chronologically. No editorials. Just facts. She took notes. Asked clarifying questions. When I got to the part about the family emergency form, she'd stopped writing and looked up. She asked if I still had a copy. I didn't. I told her I'd refused to sign it. She made a note and said that might have been the trigger. The moment they realized I wasn't going to cooperate. She'd asked about my financial support to my parents over the years. I'd walked her through it. The car. The house repairs. The bills. She'd asked if they'd ever paid me back. I said no. She asked if I'd expected them to. I said I hadn't thought of it that way. She nodded and made another note. Then she asked the hardest question. Did I think they were capable of actually hurting me? Not just fraud. Not just forgery. Actually creating the conditions for my death. I'd sat with that. Thought about it. And I'd said I didn't know. A week ago I would have said no. Now I wasn't sure. She'd closed her notebook and said they were opening a full investigation. She told me to limit contact with my family. Don't engage. Don't explain. Don't give them any information they could use. She'd walked me to the door and said I was handling this better than most people would. I'd gone home that night and sat in my living room with all the lights off. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just sat there in the dark, trying to reconcile the parents I thought I knew with the people who'd written my obituary and filed for my insurance payout. Trying to understand when I'd stopped being their daughter and started being worth more dead than alive. I grew up in a small town in Missouri where everyone knew everyone and reputation mattered more than income. My parents weren't wealthy, but they were respectable. My father worked in manufacturing, steady hours, decent benefits. My mother kept the house and did part-time bookkeeping for local businesses. We lived modestly. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that drew attention. They raised me to be self-sufficient, and I was. Maybe too much. By the time I was 16, I had 2 part-time jobs and a plan to pay for college myself. They didn't stop me. I'm not sure they would have helped even if I'd asked. I went to a state university on an ROTC scholarship. Full ride. The Air Force paid for my education in exchange for service after graduation. My parents had been proud of that in their own way. Proud that I'd figured it out. Proud that they didn't have to pay. They came to my commissioning ceremony when I graduated, stood in the back during the oath, took a few pictures. My mother cried a little. My father shook my hand. It felt like closure, like I'd successfully launched and now I was on my own. I was fine with that. I liked being on my own. But then I started sending money home. Not because they asked, at least not directly. But because I had it and they didn't, and it seemed like the right thing to do. When my mother's car broke down during my first year as a second lieutenant, I bought her a new one. Used, but reliable. She'd cried again. My father had clapped me on the shoulder and said I was doing well for myself. It felt good. It felt like I was taking care of them the way they'd taken care of me. Except they hadn't, really. They'd provided the basics. Kept me fed and housed and clothed. But they hadn't paid for college. Hadn't helped with expenses. Hadn't supported my career in any material way. I'd done that myself. Still, I sent money. I paid off credit cards when they mentioned debt. I covered the new roof when theirs started leaking. I replaced their ancient HVAC system when it died in the middle of summer. Every time, they thanked me. Every time, it felt a little less like gratitude and a little more like expectation. When I made captain at 29, they drove 6 hours to the promotion ceremony. They arrived late, missed the actual pinning, but they stayed for the reception. They took photos with me in my service dress uniform, posted them on Facebook with captions about how proud they were. My mother's friends commented. My father's coworkers liked the posts. I got congratulations messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. It felt hollow. They hadn't asked how I was doing. Hadn't asked what the promotion meant for my career. They'd just showed up for the performance. That was when I started noticing the imbalance. I was 30 years old, a mid-career officer, and I was still trying to earn my parents' approval by taking care of them financially. They never asked directly. It was always hints. Mentions of bills. Concerns about retirement. Suggestions that I was doing so well and they were struggling. I never said no. I didn't know how. So I kept sending money. Kept covering expenses. Kept telling myself it was temporary, that once they got back on their feet, it would stop. Daniel showed up about a year after that. My aunt had mentioned he was having a hard time, that he'd lost another job and was trying to get back into financial consulting. She'd asked if I'd talk to him, maybe give him some advice. I'd said sure. We'd met for coffee. He'd been charming. A little too charming. He'd asked about my career, my benefits, my plans for the future. I'd kept it vague. Something about him felt off, but I couldn't pinpoint it. A few months later, he was at my parents' house for Sunday dinner. Then he was there every time I visited. My parents started quoting him. Daniel says this. Daniel thinks that. Daniel's been helping us understand our finances. I'd asked what kind of help. They'd said estate planning. Making sure everything was organized. I'd thought that was reasonable. I didn't realize they were planning my estate. The last time I'd felt truly close to my parents was probably 10 years ago, before I started making enough money to be useful. Back when I was just their daughter, not their retirement plan. I'd been home on leave after my first deployment, exhausted and wired and trying to readjust to normal life. My mother had made dinner. My father had asked careful questions about where I'd been, what I'd done, if I was okay. It had felt like they saw me. Not the uniform. Not the rank. Just me. I'd fallen asleep on their couch that night, and my mother had covered me with a blanket. I'd woken up to the smell of coffee and the sound of my father turning on the morning news. It had felt like home. I don't know when that changed. Maybe it was gradual. Maybe it was always transactional and I just didn't want to see it. But by the time I hit 03 and started making decent money, the dynamic had shifted. They needed things. I provided them. They appreciated it, but they also expected it. And when expectation turns into entitlement, it stops feeling like family. It starts feeling like obligation. I thought about that a lot in the days after I found the obituary. I thought about all the times I'd justified their behavior. All the times I'd told myself they were just worried, just concerned, just trying to be involved in my life. I'd ignored the red flags because I wanted them to be good people. I wanted to believe they loved me more than they loved what I could give them. But the evidence was mounting and I was running out of excuses. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was the clarity. Understanding that they'd probably been working toward this for months, maybe longer. Understanding that every question about my schedule, every inquiry about my benefits, every conversation with Daniel had been part of a plan. They'd been preparing for my death while I was preparing for my next promotion. They'd seen me as a problem to solve, a payout to secure, and they'd gone about it methodically. I could almost respect the planning if it hadn't been my life they were planning to end. Base Legal called me in for a follow-up meeting 72 hours after I'd first reported the obituary. They'd been coordinating with OSI, and Special Agent Hearn was there when I arrived, along with a JAG captain I hadn't met before. They had me sit. They had me review documents. They walked me through every piece of information I'd ever given my parents over the years. Bank account numbers I'd shared for direct deposits when helping with bills. Copies of my orders I'd sent them so they'd know where I was deploying. Scans of my CAC, my Common Access Card, that I'd emailed for tax paperwork purposes. I'd been careful, but I'd also trusted them. And trust leaves a trail. Agent Hearn explained that the fake obituary had been traced back to a submission made through a small funeral home's online portal. Someone had created an account using my information, verified it with documentation that looked legitimate, and submitted the death notice. The funeral home had published it in good faith. They were cooperating fully now, but they'd had no reason to question it at the time. The obituary had been designed to go live at 0600 tomorrow morning, approximately 4 hours after my scheduled night sortie was supposed to begin. If anything had happened during that flight, mechanical failure, pilot error, weather, anything, the obituary would have been public before the Air Force even notified next of kin. My parents would have looked devastated but organized. Grief-stricken but prepared. The life insurance claim was more complex. It had been filed through a third-party administrator, using forged signatures and fabricated documentation. Daniel's name was on the paperwork as the financial advisor managing the claim. The payout was substantial, enough to set my parents up comfortably for the rest of their lives. Agent Hearn said the claim had been flagged for inconsistencies, but without my intervention, it might have been processed within 30 to 60 days. The timing suggested they were expecting me to die soon. Not eventually. Soon. I'd asked the question I'd been afraid to ask. Did they think my parents were planning to sabotage the sortie? Agent Hearn had hesitated. She'd said they were investigating all possibilities. They'd pulled maintenance records on the aircraft I was supposed to fly. They were interviewing personnel. They were checking access logs. So far, nothing indicated tampering, but they weren't ruling it out. The fact remained. Someone had created conditions where my death would be easily explained and financially beneficial. That wasn't coincidence. The JAG captain had asked if I'd given my parents any reason to believe I'd changed my beneficiaries recently. I'd thought about it. The family emergency form. My refusal to sign it. That had been about 6 weeks ago, right around the time they would have started planning this. The captain had nodded. Said that was probably the catalyst. They'd realized I wasn't going to cooperate, so they'd moved forward without me. He'd asked if I wanted to press charges. I'd said I wanted to see where the investigation led first. I'd left that meeting feeling strange. Not angry, not sad, just deeply, profoundly tired. I'd gone back to my office and stared at my computer screen for 20 minutes without seeing it. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "Honey, your father and I are worried about you. Please call when you can." I'd stared at the message. She didn't know I'd found the obituary. She didn't know I'd reported the insurance claim. She was still operating under the assumption that I didn't know. That I'd never find out. I'd deleted the message without responding. That night, I'd gone to the gym on base and run until my legs gave out. 8 miles. Then I'd sat in my car in the parking lot and called Jenna, the friend who'd sent me the obituary link in the first place. She'd answered on the first ring. I'd told her everything. She'd listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she'd said what I'd been thinking, but hadn't been able to say out loud. She'd said they weren't worth it. Weren't worth my grief or my guilt or my attempts to understand. She'd said I'd spent my whole adult life trying to earn love from people who only valued me for what I could provide, and maybe it was time to stop trying. I'd sat with that. Let it settle. And I'd realized she was right. I'd been performing for my parents for years. Performing success, performing stability, performing the role of the dutiful daughter who took care of them. And they'd been performing too. Performing pride, performing affection, performing the role of supportive parents. But underneath, it was all transaction. I gave them money, they gave me approval. I provided security, they provided validation. When I'd threatened to stop, they'd tried to cut their losses. The next morning, OSI called with an update. They'd traced the obituary submission to an IP address registered to Daniel's apartment. They'd also found drafts of the obituary on his laptop, along with email correspondence with my parents discussing timing and phrasing. The emails were careful. No explicit admission of intent. But the pattern was clear. They'd been coordinating, planning, preparing for an outcome they believed was inevitable. Agent Hearn had asked if I was ready to confront them. I'd said no. Not yet. I needed to understand the full scope first. She'd said that was smart. Said a lot of people in my position would have rushed in, demanded answers, made it emotional. But emotion gives people leverage. Silence keeps them guessing. So I stayed silent. Didn't call. Didn't text. Didn't respond to their increasingly concerned messages. I let them wonder. Let them worry. Let them realize that something had shifted and they no longer had control. At work, I stayed focused. Flew training sorties. Led briefings. Mentored junior officers. My performance didn't slip. If anything, it sharpened. The clarity that came from understanding who my parents really were had stripped away a lot of distractions. I'd spent so much energy trying to maintain that relationship, trying to make them proud, trying to justify their behavior. Now that I'd stopped, I had room to focus on what actually mattered. My career. My people. My mission. Colonel Whitford had pulled me aside after a flight brief one afternoon. Asked how I was holding up. I'd told him honestly, better than expected. He'd nodded. Said he'd seen a lot of officers go through family crises over the years, and the ones who compartmentalized, who stayed professional, those were the ones who came out stronger. He'd said I was handling it exactly right. I'd thanked him. But privately, I wasn't sure. I wasn't falling apart, but I also wasn't processing. I was just moving forward. One step at a time. 2 weeks after I found the obituary, I cut off financial access entirely. I closed the joint account I'd opened to help my parents with bills. I revoked the power of attorney I'd granted them years ago for emergency purposes. I changed my beneficiaries, removing them completely and designating everything to charity. I updated my next of kin information to list Colonel Whitford as primary contact. Then I sent a single email to both my parents. It was short. Professional. Due to ongoing investigations, I will not be in contact with the family. Do not attempt further access to my records. That was it. No explanation. No emotion. Just a line in the sand. The response came within an hour. My mother. How could you accuse your own parents of something like this? We've only ever wanted what's best for you. If you're under this much stress, maybe you should consider taking leave. Talking to someone. We're worried about your mental health. I'd read it twice, flagged it, forwarded it to Agent Hearn, and archived it. My father's email came next. Whatever you think is happening, you're wrong. Daniel was trying to help us organize our affairs. If there was a misunderstanding with the insurance paperwork, we can fix it. But cutting us off like this is cruel. We're your parents. I'd archived that one too. Then Daniel reached out. His email was longer, more calculated. He claimed my parents had asked him to help with estate planning and he'd misunderstood the scope. He said he'd never meant to file anything without my knowledge. He said if I was upset, he understood, but he hoped I'd reconsider destroying my relationship with my family over a clerical error. A clerical error. I'd actually laughed when I read that. Then I'd forwarded it to Agent Hearn with a single line, "For your records." The calls started after that. Voicemails from my mother, crying, asking why I was doing this. Messages from my father, angry now, saying I was ungrateful and paranoid. Texts from Daniel, trying to smooth things over, suggesting we all sit down and talk like adults. I didn't respond to any of it. Agent Hearn had been clear, engagement gives them leverage. Silence keeps them off balance. So I stayed silent. 3 days later, my parents showed up at base access. Security forces called me at work. Said 2 individuals claiming to be my parents were at the gate demanding to see me. I'd told the airman on duty that I was not available and to deny them access. He'd asked if I wanted to file a report. I'd said it was already on file. He'd said he'd handle it. I'd gone back to work. That night, I got a message from my Aunt Evelyn, my father's sister. She said my parents had called her in tears, saying I'd turned against them, that I was refusing to see them, that they didn't understand what they'd done wrong. She said family was important, and whatever had happened, we should work it out. I'd actually responded to that one. I'd kept it brief. Told her there was an ongoing investigation, and I couldn't discuss details, but I appreciated her concern. She'd written back asking what kind of investigation. I hadn't answered. The distance was strange. For years, I'd been enmeshed in their lives. Financially, emotionally. Every decision I made, I'd considered how it would affect them. Now, with that connection severed, I felt lighter. Freer. But also unmoored. I'd built so much of my identity around being the daughter who took care of her parents. Without that role, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be. Jenna had come down for a weekend visit. We'd sat on my back patio with beer and burgers, and she'd asked the question I'd been avoiding. What did I want to happen? Did I want my parents prosecuted? Did I want them to apologize? Did I want reconciliation? I'd thought about it. Turned it over. And I'd realized I didn't know. Part of me wanted justice. Wanted them to face consequences for what they'd tried to do. But another part of me just wanted to move on. To let them fade into irrelevance. To build a life where they didn't factor at all. At work, things were moving forward. I'd been selected for a leadership development course, a requirement for officers being considered for promotion to 05. Lieutenant Colonel. It was an honor and a signal that my career was on track. Colonel Whitford had congratulated me personally. Said the board had been impressed with my performance and my potential. I'd thanked him. Felt proud. And then I'd realized my parents didn't know. Wouldn't know. And for the first time, I was okay with that. The Air Force had become my family in a way I hadn't fully appreciated before. My squadron wasn't perfect, but they were loyal. They were competent. They had my back not because of what I could give them, but because we served together. Because we trusted each other. Because that's what you do. It was simple. Clean. No hidden agendas. No resentment. Just mission and purpose and mutual respect. Agent Hearn had called with another update. The investigation was progressing. They'd confirmed the forged signatures. They'd documented the email chain between my parents and Daniel. They'd established intent. The insurance company had permanently flagged all parties involved, which meant my parents would never be able to file another claim in my name. But criminal charges were complicated. Fraud required proof of material harm, and since I'd caught it before payout, the harm was attempted, not completed. The JAG office was weighing options. I'd asked what she recommended. She'd said that was up to me. They could pursue charges, but it would mean depositions, testimony, months of legal process. It would keep me connected to my parents in the worst possible way. Or I could let the administrative consequences stand. Let them live with the knowledge that they'd failed. That I knew. That I'd moved on. She'd said both were valid choices. I'd told her I needed time to think. That night, I'd stood in my kitchen and realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was just done. My parents had shown me who they were, and I'd believed them. They'd chosen money over relationship, payout over person. And I'd chosen to walk away. Not out of spite. Not out of revenge. Just out of self-preservation. Because staying connected to people who saw me as an asset wasn't healthy. It wasn't family. It was just damage. 6 months later, I was standing in a different conference room being promoted to lieutenant colonel. The ceremony was small. Just my squadron, a few close friends, Colonel Whitford officiating. Jenna had flown in to pin my new rank on my shoulders. I'd asked her to do it weeks before. She'd cried a little when I asked. Said she was honored. When the moment came, when she lifted the silver oak leaves and attached them to my uniform, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride that wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. Pride that was just mine. My parents sent a card. It arrived at my office 2 days after the promotion. My mother's handwriting on the envelope. Inside, a generic congratulations message and a note. We saw the announcement online. We're so proud of you. We hope one day you'll let us back into your life. We love you. I'd read it once, then filed it away. Didn't respond. Didn't react. Just acknowledged it existed and moved on. Daniel had sent an email around the same time. Congratulations on your promotion. I hope you know I never meant any harm. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. I'd marked it as spam and let the system handle it from there. The consequences for them had been quiet but real. The insurance company had blacklisted them, which meant they'd struggle to get any kind of policy in the future. OSI had closed the case with administrative findings but no criminal charges, largely because I'd declined to pursue prosecution. I'd decided Agent Hearn was right. Criminal charges would have kept me tied to them for months, maybe years. I didn't want that. I wanted them to fade into the background of my life. Distant. Irrelevant. Gone. My Aunt Evelyn had called once, a few months after the promotion. She'd said my parents were struggling. That my father had lost his job. That my mother's health wasn't great. She'd asked if I would consider helping them out. Just one more time. I'd been kind but firm. I'd told her I couldn't. That they needed to find other resources. That I wasn't in a position to support them anymore. She'd sighed. Said she understood but hoped I'd reconsider. I hadn't. And eventually, she'd stopped asking. The hardest part of moving on wasn't cutting them off. It was resisting the urge to go back. Every time my mother's birthday came around, every time a holiday approached, I felt the pull. The old programming. The sense that I should reach out. Should fix things. Should be the bigger person. But I'd learned that being the bigger person doesn't mean tolerating people who hurt you. It means having the strength to protect yourself. So I didn't reach out. Didn't send cards. Didn't call. I just let time pass. Work became the center of my life in a way it hadn't been before. I poured myself into leadership. Into mentoring the younger officers in my squadron. Into building the kind of team culture I'd always believed in. I led by example. Stayed calm under pressure. Made decisions based on mission and people, not politics or ego. And people noticed. My performance reports were strong. My evaluations were excellent. I was building a reputation not just as a competent officer, but as someone people wanted to work for. Colonel Whitford pulled me aside one afternoon and told me I was being considered for a command position. Squadron commander. It was a big step, a significant leadership role, and a clear sign that my career was on an upward trajectory. He'd said I'd earned it. That my ability to stay focused and professional despite personal challenges had impressed the senior leadership. I'd thanked him. And I'd meant it. Because the Air Force had given me something my family never did. A place where my value wasn't tied to what I could provide financially. A place where competence and character mattered more than obligation. I'd started building new traditions. Friendships that weren't transactional. Holidays spent with my squadron or with Jenna or alone. I'd learned that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up when you need them. who support you without expecting anything in return, who see you for who you are, not what you can give them. And once I understood that, the loss of my parents hurt less. Because I hadn't lost family. I'd lost people who never really were. The nightmares stopped around month 8. I'd been having them intermittently since finding the obituary. Dreams where I was flying and the aircraft failed. Dreams where I showed up to work and everyone treated me like I was already dead. Dreams where my parents stood over my grave counting money. But gradually, they faded. My subconscious let go of what my conscious mind had already processed. I was safe. I was free. I was moving forward. Agent Hearn had checked in periodically. More as a friend than an investigator by that point. She'd told me she admired how I'd handled everything. That a lot of people in my situation would have fallen apart or sought revenge or stayed stuck in grief. But I just moved on. Built a new life. Focused on what mattered. She'd said that was rare. I'd told her it was survival. You can't change people who don't want to change. You can only control your response. So I'd chosen to respond with distance and dignity. By the time a year had passed, the whole situation felt distant. Like something that had happened to someone else. I could talk about it without emotion. Could explain it without anger. It had become part of my story, but it didn't define me. I was Lieutenant Colonel Elaine Rourke, Air Force officer, squadron commander, mentor, leader. What my parents had tried to do was a footnote. A cautionary tale. But not my identity. The final piece of closure came unexpectedly. I was at a conference in Washington when I ran into a senior officer I'd worked with years before. We grabbed coffee, caught up on careers and assignments, and at some point, he'd mentioned reading an article about life insurance fraud in military families. He'd said it was more common than people realized. That the combination of high-risk jobs and substantial death benefits created incentives for bad actors. He'd said it casually, not knowing my history. And I'd realized he was right. What happened to me wasn't unique. It was a pattern. A problem. And maybe understanding that helped me stop taking it personally. I'd gone back to my hotel room that night and written down everything that had happened. Not for publication. Not for anyone else. Just for me. A record. A way of organizing the chaos into something coherent. I'd written about the early warning signs. The obituary. The betrayal. The investigation. The aftermath. And as I wrote, I'd realized something. I wasn't a victim. I was someone who'd identified a threat, neutralized it, and moved on. That was leadership. That was strength. That was survival. My parents tried to reach out one more time about a year and a half after everything started. A letter this time. Handwritten by my mother. She'd said they were sorry. That they'd made mistakes. That Daniel had pushed them into something they didn't fully understand. That they missed me. That they hoped I could forgive them. I'd read it carefully. Looking for accountability. For real remorse. And I'd found excuses. Blame shifting. Minimization. They were sorry they'd been caught. Sorry I'd reacted badly. But not sorry for what they'd actually done. I'd written back. One final time. I'd kept it short. Told them I appreciated the letter, but I'd moved on. That I wished them well, but I wasn't interested in rebuilding a relationship. That they should focus on their own lives and I'd focus on mine. I'd mailed it. And that was it. The last communication. The final boundary. People asked sometimes how I'd managed to forgive them. I always corrected them. I hadn't forgiven them. Forgiveness implies reconciliation, and there was no reconciliation to be had. What I'd done was accept what happened, process it, and let it go. I didn't carry anger because anger would have hurt me more than them. I didn't carry guilt because I hadn't done anything wrong. I just carried the knowledge that I'd survived something difficult and come out stronger. The squadron command position became official. I took over a unit of 60 personnel, responsible for operations, training, and mission readiness. It was demanding, exhausting, fulfilling. I loved it. Loved the challenge. Loved building a team. Loved seeing junior officers grow under my leadership. This was what I was meant to do. This was where I belonged. Jenna had asked me once if I'd ever regret cutting my parents out of my life. I'd thought about it. Really considered it. And I'd told her no. because regret implies you made the wrong choice. And I hadn't. I'd made the only choice that protected my well-being and my future. They'd shown me who they were. I'd believed them. And I'd acted accordingly. That wasn't something to regret. That was something to be proud of. The final update from Agent Hearn came about 2 years after everything started. She'd called to let me know the case was being officially archived. All administrative actions had been completed. The insurance company had settled internally. My parents and Daniel had no further recourse. It was over. She'd asked how I was doing. I'd told her honestly, better than ever. She'd said she was glad. Said she'd worked a lot of cases over the years and mine had stuck with her. Because I'd handled it with more grace and professionalism than she'd seen before. I'd thanked her. Told her I couldn't have done it without her guidance. She'd laughed and said I would have been fine either way. As I hung up, I'd looked around my office. Certificates on the wall. Photos from deployments and ceremonies. A coffee mug from my squadron with my call sign stenciled on the side. This was my life now. Not perfect. Not without challenges. But mine. Built on my terms. Shaped by my choices. And no one could take that from me. 3 years after I found my own obituary, I was sitting in a joint operations brief when someone made a joke about life insurance. The room laughed. I laughed too. Because it didn't hurt anymore. It was just a thing that happened. A chapter I'd closed. I'd moved past it so completely that it no longer had power over me. That felt like victory. Not the loud, triumphant kind. The quiet, enduring kind. I'd been promoted on schedule. Made 05 at 39, exactly where I should have been based on my performance and potential. I was still leading my squadron, still mentoring junior officers, still flying when the mission required it. My life had stabilized into something sustainable. Something good. I had friends I trusted. Work I valued. Purpose I believed in. That was enough. My parents never reached out again after that final letter. I didn't know if they were still together. Still in the same house. Still in contact with Daniel. I didn't ask. Didn't search for information. Didn't follow their social media if they had any. I'd let them go completely. And in doing so, I'd reclaimed the mental and emotional space they'd occupied for so long. Aunt Evelyn had stopped calling too. I assumed she'd realized I wasn't going to change my mind. That the door I'd closed wasn't going to reopen. I hoped she understood it wasn't personal. I didn't wish harm on any of them. I just didn't want them in my life. There's a difference between holding a grudge and maintaining a boundary. I'd learned that distinction well. The Air Force had given me opportunities one might not have pursued if everything hadn't fallen apart. I'd become a stronger leader because I'd had to rely on myself. I'd developed deeper relationships with my squadron because I understood the value of loyalty and trust. I'd built a career based on competence and integrity because I'd seen what happened when people operated from greed and entitlement. In a strange way, my parents' betrayal had clarified my values. Had shown me what mattered. I'd started speaking occasionally at leadership courses. Sharing lessons learned. Not about my family, that stayed private, but about resilience. About making hard decisions. About staying focused when everything around you is chaos. The junior officers listened. Asked questions. Told me afterwards that my perspective helped them. That made me feel like I'd turned something painful into something useful. That was its own kind of healing. Jenna got married. I stood up as her maid of honor. It was a small wedding, close friends and family, and at the reception she'd pulled me aside and thanked me for being the kind of friend who showed up. Who stayed. Who didn't require constant maintenance or validation. She'd said she'd watched me rebuild my life, and it had inspired her to be braver in her own. I'd hugged her. Told her I was proud of her. Meant it completely. That night, standing at the edge of the dance floor watching Jenna and her husband, I'd realized I was happy. Not in a loud, exuberant way. Just quietly content. My life looked different than I'd imagined it would. I was single. Child-free. Estranged from my family of origin. But I was surrounded by people who cared about me. I was doing work that mattered. I was building a legacy I could be proud of. That was more than enough. I thought about the obituary sometimes. Not with fear or anger. Just with a kind of detached curiosity. Someone had written my death notice while I was still alive. Had tried to profit from my loss before it happened. It was surreal, disturbing, but also clarifying, because it had forced me to confront the reality of my family dynamic. Had given me permission to walk away. In a twisted way, it had set me free. I kept a copy of it, filed away in a locked drawer in my home office. Not because I wanted to dwell on it, but because I wanted to remember. Wanted to have evidence if I ever started to doubt my decision. Wanted to be able to look back and say, this happened. This was real. And I survived it. People talk about forgiveness like it's the only path to healing. Like you have to reconcile with the people who hurt you in order to move on. But I'd learned that wasn't true. You can heal without forgiving. You can move on without reconciling. You can build a good life without the people who tried to destroy you. It's not cold. It's not cruel. It's just self-preservation. And there's strength in that. The Air Force had taught me a lot over the years. Discipline, leadership, resilience. But the most important lesson I'd learned wasn't in any manual or training course. It was this: you can't control what other people do. You can only control how you respond. My parents tried to kill me on paper. I responded by cutting them out of my life and building something better. They wrote my ending. I wrote my future. And my future was a hell of a lot brighter than anything they'd imagined. As I moved into my 4th year post-obituary, I found myself reflecting less and looking forward more. I was being considered for a staff position at Air Force Headquarters. It was a prestigious assignment. A chance to influence policy. To shape the future of the service. Colonel Whitford had nominated me personally. Said I had the judgment and the temperament for it. I'd submitted my application. Prepared for interviews. And I'd felt genuine excitement. Not because I was running from something, but because I was running towards something. That was the real victory. Not that I'd survived my parents' betrayal, but that I'd built a life worth living despite it. A life where I was valued for who I was, not what I could provide. A life where my contributions mattered and my integrity was respected. A life where family meant loyalty and trust, not obligation and exploitation. That was what I'd fought for. And that was what I'd won. The final thing I wanted people to understand was this: betrayal doesn't have to break you. It can clarify you. Can show you who people really are. Can give you permission to choose yourself. My parents wrote my obituary before I was dead. But I wrote my story after I survived. And my story is one of resilience. Of boundary setting. Of choosing self-respect over family obligation. Of building a life on my own terms. They tried to end my story. I just started a new chapter. And this chapter? It's mine. 10 years after I found my obituary, I was sitting in my office at the Pentagon with the kind of view that still surprised me sometimes. Colonel Elaine Rourke, 06, assigned to the office of the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. The nameplate on my door was new enough that I still noticed it when I walked in each morning. 44 years old. 22 years of service. A career that had exceeded every expectation I'd set for myself back when I was a second lieutenant, trying to figure out how to be an officer and a daughter at the same time. The promotion to 06 had come 2 years earlier, right on schedule, the result of strong performance reports and command time that had gone well. I'd led my squadron for 3 years, then moved to a group-level position, then here. Each assignment had built on the last. Each evaluation had been top tier. I'd worked hard, stayed focused, and risen through the ranks the way you're supposed to when you're competent and consistent. The Air Force had become more than a career. It was the stable foundation I'd built my entire adult life on. I hadn't thought about my parents in months. That wasn't avoidance or denial. It was just reality. They'd become irrelevant to my daily life. I had no idea where they were, what they were doing, if they were even still alive. I'd created such complete separation that they existed only as a historical fact. People who used to be in my life. People who'd made choices that ended our relationship. Nothing more. Jenna called that distance healthy. She'd gotten divorced 2 years after her wedding, moved to Denver, started a new career in tech consulting. We still talked regularly. She'd asked me once if I ever looked them up online. Searched their names. Checked social media. I'd told her no. She'd asked why not. I'd said because it wouldn't change anything. Knowing they were struggling wouldn't make me want to help them. Knowing they were thriving wouldn't make me happy for them. They were strangers who happened to share my DNA. I didn't need updates on strangers. But then something happened that I hadn't anticipated. I was sitting in my living room on a Saturday morning, coffee in hand, scrolling through news on my tablet, when I saw a name I recognized. Daniel Rourke. Arrested for insurance fraud. Multiple counts. The article was brief, mostly details about a scheme he'd been running for years, targeting elderly clients and military families. The investigation had been ongoing for 18 months. He was facing federal charges. Possible prison time. I'd read the article twice. Then I'd set down my tablet and stared at the wall. I wasn't surprised. Not really. What he'd tried to do to me had been calculated enough that I'd always assumed it wasn't his first attempt. But seeing it in print, seeing that he'd continued targeting people, that made something twist in my chest. Not guilt, exactly. I hadn't been responsible for stopping him. But a kind of quiet regret that more people had been hurt. I'd forwarded the article to Agent Lila Hearn. She'd retired from OSI 3 years earlier, but we'd stayed in occasional contact. She'd called me within an hour. Said she'd already seen it. Said the investigating agents had reached out to her because my case was part of the pattern. They wanted to know if I'd be willing to provide a statement. I'd said yes. She'd said she'd put me in touch with the lead investigator. Then she'd asked how I was doing. I'd told her honestly, fine. This didn't change anything for me. It was just confirmation of what I'd already known. The federal agent called 2 days later. Special Agent Marcus Chin, FBI, White Collar Crime Division. He'd been polite, professional, thorough. He'd walked me through what they'd uncovered. Daniel had targeted at least 15 families over the past decade. Military members mostly. People with substantial life insurance policies and complicated family dynamics. He'd posed as a financial advisor, gained their trust, then worked with family members to file fraudulent claims. Sometimes the service member was deployed. Sometimes they were isolated. Sometimes they just didn't have strong support systems. He'd exploited vulnerabilities systematically. Agent Chen had asked me to describe what happened in my case. I'd given him the full timeline. The obituary. The forged insurance claim. My parents' involvement. OSI's investigation. The administrative consequences. He'd taken notes. Asked clarifying questions. Then he'd asked if I'd be willing to testify if the case went to trial. I'd said yes. He'd thanked me. Said my case was one of the cleaner ones because I'd documented everything so thoroughly. Said it would help establish pattern and intent. After we hung up, I'd sat with the information. Tried to process what it meant. 15 families. 15 people who'd been targeted the way I had. Some of them had probably lost money. Some had probably lost relationships. Some had probably spent years trying to recover. I'd been lucky. I'd caught it early. I'd had resources. I'd had Agent Hearn's guidance and Colonel Whitford's support and a system that, while imperfect, had ultimately protected me. Not everyone had that. I'd thought about reaching out to my parents. Just to see if they knew. If they cared. If they felt any responsibility for enabling him. But I dismissed the idea almost immediately. They'd made their choices. They'd participated willingly. Whether Daniel had manipulated them or they'd been full partners didn't really matter. They'd signed the documents. They'd played their role. And they'd never taken accountability. Reaching out would just reopen a door I'd closed for good reason. The next few months were strange. I gave my statement to Agent Chen. Provided documentation from OSI's original investigation. Answered follow-up questions. The case was building. Daniel was denying everything, claiming he'd been trying to help families with estate planning and things had been misunderstood. The same line he'd used with me. But the evidence was overwhelming. Email chains. Forged documents. Bank records showing payments. Testimony from other victims. It was just a matter of time. Work kept me grounded. I was managing a portfolio of operational initiatives. Leading meetings with general officers. Briefing senior leadership on policy recommendations. The work was demanding but satisfying. I was good at it. I understood how to navigate bureaucracy. How to build consensus. how to communicate complex ideas clearly. The skills I'd developed over 2 decades of service had prepared me for this. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But the case stirred up things I thought I'd fully processed. I started having dreams again. Not nightmares exactly. Just fragments. My mother's voice asking about my insurance. My father's face when I refused to sign their form. Daniel's smile across the dinner table. The dreams weren't frightening. They were just present. Reminders that the past wasn't as settled as I'd thought. I'd started seeing a therapist about 6 months after the Daniel news broke. Not because I was falling apart. I wasn't. But because I wanted to process this new information in a healthy way. Wanted to make sure I wasn't carrying things I didn't need to carry. The therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, was a civilian contractor who worked with DoD personnel. She was calm, insightful, and didn't push me to feel things I didn't feel. In one of our early sessions, she'd asked what I wanted from therapy. I'd told her I wanted to make sure I'd truly moved on. That I wasn't just avoiding my feelings about my parents. That my decision to maintain distance was healthy and not harmful. She'd asked what I thought. I'd said I thought it was healthy. That boundaries weren't the same as avoidance. That I'd processed my grief and anger years ago. That I'd built a good life without them. She'd nodded. Said it sounded like I'd done the work. Said sometimes therapy is just about confirming that you're on the right path. We'd talked about the case. About what it meant that Daniel had hurt other people. About whether I felt responsible for not doing more to stop him. I'd admitted that I did feel some responsibility. Not legal responsibility, but moral responsibility. I'd known he was dangerous, and I'd focused on protecting myself rather than warning others. Dr. Kim had asked if there was anything I realistically could have done differently. I'd thought about it. At the time, I'd had no proof he was targeting other people. I'd reported everything to OSI. I'd cooperated fully with their investigation. What else could I have done? She'd said exactly. Said I'd taken appropriate action. That the rest wasn't on me. But still, knowing there were other victims stayed with me. I'd asked Agent Chan if I could contact any of them. He'd said no, not while the case was active. It could compromise the investigation. But after, if they were willing, he could facilitate introductions. I'd said I'd like that. Said I wanted them to know they weren't alone. That what happened to them wasn't their fault. That they could survive it. He'd said he'd see what he could do. The trial took 18 months to get to court. Federal cases move slowly. But when it finally happened, I was ready. I flew to Virginia, where the trial was being held. Stayed in a hotel near the courthouse. Met with the prosecutor the night before I testified. She was sharp, prepared, and confident. She'd walked me through the questions she'd ask. Prepared me for cross-examination. Told me to stay calm, stick to facts, and trust the process. I'd done all of that before in military legal proceedings. This wasn't that different. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Daniel sat at the defense table in a suit that looked too expensive for someone facing bankruptcy and prison. He'd aged. Looked thinner. More tired. When I walked in, he'd looked up. Our eyes had met for just a second. I'd felt nothing. No anger. No satisfaction. Nothing. He was just a person who'd tried to hurt me and failed. That was all. I'd testified for 2 hours. Walked through the timeline. Described my parents' behavior. Explained the obituary and the insurance claim. Answered questions about how I discovered it, what I'd done, what the consequences had been. The prosecutor had been methodical. The defense attorney had tried to suggest I'd misunderstood my parents' intentions. That they'd been trying to help me organize my affairs. That I'd overreacted. I'd stayed calm. Cited specific evidence. Referenced OSI's findings. By the end, even the defense attorney looked like he knew it wasn't working. When I stepped down, I'd looked at the jury. 12 faces, a mix of ages and backgrounds. I couldn't tell what they were thinking. But I'd done my part. I'd told the truth. The rest was up to them. Other victims testified over the following days. I wasn't allowed in the courtroom for their testimony, but I read the summaries in the news coverage. A widow whose husband had died in Afghanistan and Daniel had tried to redirect her survivor benefits. An active duty soldier whose parents had filed a fraudulent claim while he was deployed to Iraq. A retired Marine whose sister had forged his signature on policy documents. The pattern was clear. The predation was systematic. Daniel had built an entire operation around exploiting military families. The verdict came back guilty on 14 of 16 counts. The 2 acquittals were technicalities, cases where the statute of limitations had run out. But the convictions were solid. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. The prosecutor called to thank me for my testimony. Said it had been crucial in establishing the pattern. Said justice had been served. I'd thanked her, but I'd felt oddly empty. Justice was fine, but it didn't undo the damage. Didn't give people back the years they'd spent recovering. Sentencing day I didn't attend. I had work. A briefing I couldn't miss. But Agent Chin called me afterwards. Daniel had gotten 12 years in federal prison. Restitution ordered for all victims. Permanent prohibition from working in financial services. It was a significant sentence. A clear message that this kind of fraud wouldn't be tolerated. I'd thanked him. Asked if he'd been able to connect me with any of the other victims. He'd said he'd work on it. 3 of them reached out over the next few months. 2 emails and 1 phone call. All of them had seen my name in the case documents. All of them had wanted to say thank you. Thank you for testifying. Thank you for helping put him away. Thank you for being strong enough to report it. I'd responded to each one. Told them I was sorry for what they'd gone through. Told them they were brave for coming forward. Told them their lives could be good again despite what happened. One of them, a former Army captain named James Pritchard, had asked if I'd be willing to meet for coffee if I was ever in his area. He lived in North Carolina. I'd been scheduled for a conference there a month later. So I'd said yes. We'd met at a cafe near Fort Bragg. He'd been younger than me, mid-30s, medically retired after injuries in Iraq. His mother and uncle had filed a fraudulent claim while he was in recovery. He'd found out when the insurance company flagged it. The betrayal had shattered him. He'd spent years rebuilding. We talked for 3 hours. About the shock. The disbelief. The way it changes how you see family. The process of letting go. He'd asked how I'd moved on so completely. I'd told him the truth. I'd had support. I'd had resources. I'd had a career that gave me purpose. And I'd made a choice to prioritize my well-being over loyalty to people who'd proven they didn't deserve it. He'd nodded. Said he was still working on that last part. I'd told him it takes time. That there's no timeline for healing. That he'd get there. When we'd parted, he'd hugged me. Said meeting me had helped. Said knowing someone else had gone through it and come out okay gave him hope. I'd driven back to my hotel feeling something I hadn't expected. Gratitude. Not for what happened, but for the fact that my experience could help someone else. That the worst thing my parents had done to me had somehow equipped me to support others. That felt like meaning. Like purpose. Like redemption. Back at the Pentagon, life continued. I was being considered for a 1-star position. Brigadier General. It was a long shot. The selection rate for 07 was low and getting lower. But my record was strong. My performance was consistent. I had command time, staff time, joint experience. I'd deployed twice. I'd led at every level. I was competitive. Whether I'd get selected was another question. But I was in the running. That alone felt like validation. Jenna had asked if I was nervous about it. I'd said no. Because if I made it, great. If I didn't, I'd still have had a career I was proud of. I'd still have served with honor. I'd still have made a difference. The rank was nice. But it wasn't why I stayed. I stayed because I believed in the mission. Because I valued the people. Because the Air Force had given me a family when my biological family failed me. That was worth more than any promotion. On the 10-year anniversary of finding my obituary, I'd taken the day off. Not to wallow. Just to reflect. I'd driven out to Great Falls Park, found a quiet spot overlooking the Potomac, and sat on a bench with a thermos of coffee. I'd thought about who I was 10 years ago. A major, scared and confused, staring at her own death notice. And who I was now. A colonel, confident and clear, leading at the highest levels of the Air Force. The journey between those 2 points hadn't been linear. There'd been setbacks. Moments of doubt. Times when I'd wondered if I'd made the right choice cutting off my parents. But sitting there, watching the water rush over the rocks, I knew I had. Because the life I'd built was mine. The relationships I'd cultivated were genuine. The career I'd developed was based on merit. I wasn't performing for anyone's approval. I wasn't trying to earn love through achievement. I was just living. Honestly. Authentically. Freely. I'd pulled out my phone and opened my notes app. Written a few thoughts. Not for anyone else. Just for me. A record of where I'd been and where I was going. I wrote about resilience. About the difference between forgiving and moving on. About how sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people go. About how family is built through loyalty and trust, not blood and obligation. About how surviving betrayal doesn't make you bitter if you choose not to let it. When I got home that evening, there was a letter waiting in my mailbox. No return address. Postmarked from Missouri. My mother's handwriting. I'd stood in my kitchen holding it for a long time, debating whether to open it. Part of me was curious. 10 years of silence and now this. What could she possibly have to say? But another part of me didn't want to know. Didn't want to invite them back into my headspace. Didn't want to risk the peace I'd built. I'd decided to wait. Put the letter in a drawer unopened. Told myself if I still wanted to read it in a week, I would. But if not, I'd throw it away. That felt like a good compromise. Control without reactivity. The week passed. I never opened it. Eventually, I shredded it. Whatever my mother wanted to say, it was 10 years too late. I didn't need her apology or her explanation or her attempt at reconciliation. I'd built a life without her. A good life. A life I was proud of. That was enough. Colonel Whitford, now a 2-star general himself, called a few weeks later. Said he'd heard I was being considered for '07. Said he'd written a recommendation letter. Said he believed I'd be an outstanding general officer. I'd thanked him. Told him how much his support had meant over the years. He'd said I'd earned it. That watching me handle the situation with my family had shown him I had the judgment and the character for senior leadership. That leaders who can maintain composure and integrity under personal crisis are the ones who can be trusted with greater responsibility. The selection board results came out 3 months later. I didn't make it. I was an alternate. That meant if someone declined or retired, I might get selected. But for now, I'd stay in '06. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't disappointed. I'd worked hard. I'd hoped for it. But I also knew the statistics. Knew that most people don't make general. Knew that having a successful career as a colonel was still an incredible achievement. So I'd called Jenna. Told her the news. She'd said she was sorry. I'd said I was okay. And I was. Because here's what I'd learned over 10 years. Your value isn't determined by your rank or your family's approval or any external measure of success. Your value is intrinsic. It's based on who you are and how you treat people and whether you can look at yourself in the mirror and feel proud. I could do that. Every day. That made me successful in the ways that actually mattered. I continued serving. Continued leading. Continued mentoring junior officers who reminded me of my younger self. I'd told them things I wish someone had told me. That it's okay to set boundaries. That family obligation isn't the same as family loyalty. That you can love people and still choose not to have them in your life. That your career can be your foundation. That surviving hard things makes you stronger. That building a life on your own terms is worth whatever it costs. 10 years after my parents tried to profit from my death, I was thriving. Not in spite of what happened. Not because of what happened. Just independent of it. They'd tried to write my ending. I'd written my story instead. And my story was one of resilience, integrity, and the choice to keep moving forward. They were a chapter. A difficult chapter. But just a chapter. The rest of the book was mine to write. And I was writing something worth reading. That's how it all unfolded, the obituary, the forged signatures, and the decision that finally drew the line for good. If you've ever had to walk away from people who were supposed to protect you, I'd like to hear how you handled it. Did you cut ties completely? Did they ever try to come back? Would you have confronted them or done exactly what I did? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. If this story hit close to home, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. I share more real stories about boundaries, betrayal, and taking back your future. See you in the next one.